Welcome to everyone joining us for the Earnscliffe Political Strategy Panel. My name is Kaveri Braid. I'm a managing principal here at Earnscliffe, based out of our Saskatchewan office, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. Now, those of you who've been here with us before know that this panel is held on the first Thursday of every month, and it's a different one. It's to give our audiences and our clients some insight into the debates that go on under our roof, which then help us build the foundation for the strategies we implement for our clients. So with that, let me introduce you to our panelists today. From our Ottawa office, we have our principal, Marianne Carter. Back again for a second time is Chris Ball, a principal in our strategic communications practice based in our Toronto office. We have Jamie Miley, who is our principal in our Saskatoon office. And on the West Coast, we have our principal, Carling Dick, joining us from our Vancouver office. Welcome again to all our panelists. Now, before we start, I want to encourage participation from our viewers. I want you to ask us some questions on any of the topics we cover in today's webinar. And how you can do that is by simply using the chat function on the bottom of your screen. So my colleague Carling will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we will definitely be answering a few of them throughout this hour. So let's get started. The pandemic, of course, continues to dominate many of the debates amongst my colleagues here at Earnscliffe. Canada is now closing in on the 1 million mark of confirmed cases of COVID. And even though we are down from a high of the more than 9,200 new daily cases since early January, the number of new cases has increased steadily over the recent weeks as we enter the third wave of the pandemic and battling the new variants. We now sit at more than 5,500 cases across Canada as of yesterday, and close to 23,000 people have died from contracting COVID. Just today, we're hearing that Ontario is poised to enter a potential 28-day province-wide lockdown as of new COVID cases and ICU admissions continue to climb in that province. And I believe there is a news conference with Doug Ford this afternoon at 1:30 Eastern. So let's get started. Chris, let's start with you first. What's your assessment on the implications on whether the Ford government has acted quickly enough?
I mean, if the question is, did they act quickly enough? Short answer is no. So some of the first reports of Ontario being in this third wave began March 15th. That's when the Ontario Hospital Association first sounded a huge alarm. It may have been plastered across every major Ontario newspaper and news outlet. And we saw the numbers increase steadily since then. We've kind of, you're kind of getting the sense that we've saw this car crash happening in slow motion, and then we kind of rubbernecked it while saying, man, those kids these days, they sure do drive crazy, right? We've been hearing things from the government and the premier about, you know, we're not going to hesitate. We're not going to hesitate to take action. 15 days after the Ontario Hospital Association sounded the alarm that we're in a third wave. And then we hear, we're not going to hesitate, but stay tuned, Ontario, for an announcement about a lockdown the next day, like it's an episode of The Bachelor, and we have to wait for the commercial break. So a little bit of a communications and governing tip for friends is, don't say you won't hesitate, just actually don't hesitate to do something, and then explain the reasoning why and what's going to happen, how it's going to impact your life. And what I'm seeing, if you allow, Ms. Moderator, what we're seeing when they do something, the extent of this lockdown in Toronto is basically, and Toronto, by the way, being the epicenter of the outbreak here in Ontario, Toronto, Peel, Brampton, Mississauga, no patios. That's basically the difference between November and now, no patios. And it's frustrating to see, because what the whole, like, the war on the patio is really just a fake war, because it's a convenient enemy. it puts the downward pressure on individual responsibility and not on government to actually come up with a solution. It's like the whole dialogue about frontline heroes. It's just sort of a convenient distraction, not to say that we shouldn't celebrate the hardworking people that are out there busting their butts to help us out and make sure my family is safe. But we should actually give them the tools to be able to manage their own health, to be able to then do their jobs. Things like, I don't know, paid sick days. What we're seeing right now is the majority of caseload is affecting essential workers. These are the people that are selling us our lattes when we have our little breaks from lockdowns. These are the people that are triaging the human cost of this third wave that, again, started on March the 15th, right? And so it's frustrating to see this idea of we're going to say a lot of things, but we're not going to do a lot of things when you actually have tools available to you, like paying people to stay home. Pay people to stay home so that they don't infect their family, so they don't infect other folks. When people don't have the economic ability to stay home, they spread COVID-19. So for the love of goodness, can we please give these frontline heroes the tools that they need to make sure that their own health is taken care of?
Chris, thanks. I love your passion on this, on that answer. Marianne, I'm going to go to you because you live in Ontario as well. What are your thoughts on the latest potential lockdown and the potential human impacts it might actually have?
Well, I think, Kaveri, it's not, obviously there's been a lot of drama here in Ontario over the last couple of days. Premier Ford is anticipated, or not anticipated, but is going to be delivering this message that we're all acutely aware of, as Chris said, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. But it's in British Columbia, it's in parts of Quebec, and this is what I'd say. There's a really good piece that was just published in Maclean's a couple of days ago. It's a longer essay, but certainly worth the read. I think why I'm bringing this up is that there's a clear sentiment, I would say, between the feeling of a third lockdown and the frustration and the questioning of government decision-making, not just at the federal level, but across the country through various provincial governments. An internal audit that was released in January bluntly shows that the Public Health Agency of Canada was not ready to deal with a crisis of this nature. While we all know that many officials and frontline workers and everyone's banding together to work extremely hard, the resources just haven't been there. It's interesting because there have been stakeholders over the years flagging this and about being prepared for a pandemic or something like this in terms of stockpiling. And now I think you have this sentiment of people seeing folks in the UK, US, and several other countries, Israel, parts of Eastern Europe even, ahead of us in vaccinations. And we are seeing a huge increase, sharp increase in cases. And the most recent numbers from the Globe and Mail are anticipating 6,000 new cases a day by the end of April in Ontario alone. So I guess not to be a negative Nancy, but I really sense that the Canadian public is losing trust in the decisions of the federal government.
Okay,
And let me
Chris,
just quickly on that 6,000 number though, that 6,000 number, the province's own like really hopeful projections are based on there being a stay-at-home order issue, which is not what we're apparently going to get at 1:30, which is an added layer of frustration, which is going to also add to another layer of how can I trust that you're doing this properly? Sorry, I had to just get in there because that number is very important. No, we can say 6,000, but that's based on actually doing something meaningful, which we haven't.
A good point. Yes.
I think Canadians are also confused, frankly, because the the directions keep changing. I know out here in BC, we were told people are questioning why restaurants were open. So we, bit different from Ontario, you could still dine in with lots of protections in place. So you could still dine in restaurants, and everybody was like, well, you know, why can we do this? And the response was, well, that's not where transmissions are happening. Transmissions are happening in people's, you know, own homes, or we had some cases up in Whistler, but restaurants were safe. And then earlier this week, the provincial health officer came out and said, we got to shut restaurants. You can don't only dine outside. So people are confused. They're like, I thought you said restaurants were safe. Now they're not safe. I think people are, you know, to Marianne's point, are losing faith. They're frustrated. They're confused. There's different rules across Canada. People are, you know, talking to their friends and family across Canada, and it's like unclear what's allowed in one province versus another province. Also out here in BC, a lot of our rules aren't rules. So for example, you know, travel, you can't, you're being asked not to travel outside of your home city. But it's not a rule. They can't prevent you from traveling. So there's lots of conversations about, you know, what you actually can do and can't do. And I think people are confused, frustrated. They see the vaccine coming, a lot of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Carling. Agree with you on that frustration and bit of mixed messaging, right, and communications. So I want to, and that's, you know, the picture, I guess, in Canada. Jamie, I want to get you in on this, and let's go south of the border to our neighbors in the United States. Talk about the recent surge in new COVID cases in the US and President Biden's attempt to combat the pandemic in such a hyper politicized environment. Do you think he's being effective?
Not, it doesn't appear that he's being affected, and at least politically for now. The honeymoon seems to be continuing, and after what Americans went through for the last 4 years, there seems to be some relief, not with all for sure. They're deeply polarized about his election. But I would say that it does appear that people have, you know, at least lined up behind him insofar as their belief that, you know, adults have taken over and are running the response in that country. The problem for Canadian politicians, though, as is always the case when something's going on with our neighbor to the south, is it's a favorite Canadian pastime, of course, is to look into the neighbor's yard and see what new lawn furniture they've bought. And the response to the vaccination issue in particular, Kaveri, has been overwhelmingly more positive in terms of that country getting their people vaccinated. That tends to have turned down the volume. The volume has been turned down a little bit in this country with the introduction of more and more vaccines. However, in terms of the response in the United States, if you were to ask most Canadians who pay attention and look over there or have friends there or have people who are living there, was that the American government has actually responded better than this government. And so, but in terms of, you know, honeymoon, Biden, you know, I think it's there. It's a very tentative honeymoon. I don't think, you know, it's going to last forever. It never does. But I think on balance, I think most people, including Republicans, if you were to hard press some of them, would say, you know, probably this is going better than it was going before. But they won't say it out loud. Republicans won't say that out loud. So, yeah.
Jamie, you touched on vaccines, and I do want to address the topic of vaccine rollouts, especially on the recent findings of the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm going to throw the question to all the panelists here today. What impacts do you think those findings will have on the overall vaccine rollout? Chris, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, there's some numbers that were floating around the last couple of days around, post the news from NACI about AstraZeneca, where Canadians' heads at around vaccine hesitancy. And so, surprisingly, so far, Canadians are still feeling relatively confident around their ability, like around vaccines themselves, right? So, I think it was like something like 78% of Canadians are still stick a needle in me, let's get this over with. Like this isn't necessarily big news from me not wanting to get a vaccine. And apparently there's some numbers that 58% of Canadians are totally okay with whatever dose that they get, right? Which was actually up something like 30% from October. The challenge is though, because there's so many options, there's now a bit of like, I want the cherry vaccine. I want the Neapolitan. Like there's a bit of like shopping that's happening, and we're not going to be necessarily in that situation where you can vaccine shop. So I think, the good news on if I'm working for AstraZeneca is, 53%, which doesn't sound like good news, but it means there's room to grow, are a little bit more hesitant to take the AstraZeneca vaccine. But if you counterbalance that against the 78% of people who are saying, I'm totally fine with getting vaccinated, and then the other 58% of people who are saying, hey, just stick whatever needle you have in me, I think there's room to grow there. And I think there's a little bit of communications work that the government needs to do in partnership with some of their vaccination partners to help people overcome some of these fears. I'm sure that at some point soon we'll get another okay that, it's fine, you're okay, and here's where the actual risk lies. There's been a statistic that's been flying, which is actually quite smart communications as well as the truth, is that the risk of blood clotting of AstraZeneca versus certain birth control methods is actually higher on this end than it is actually for the AstraZeneca vaccine. So finding interesting ways and smart communications tools to actually help overcome that brand-based hesitancy will be the challenge that they need to go after.
I was really
very
sorry,
right.
Carrie. I was just going to say, I was actually really worried about all the back and forth about the AstraZeneca vaccine that's kind of happened over the last week or so. On Monday in BC, our provincial health officer announced that they wouldn't be giving it to anybody under 55. And so that kind of got me worried that people, as Chris talked about, people would pick and choose and not want to get the AstraZeneca vaccine. But the province released, I think it was something like 13,000 doses to pharmacies in BC for people 55 to 65. And the phones were overwhelmed. Like people wanted those doses. So that I thought was really, really positive. It seems like most people, maybe not everybody, but most people are listening to that advice that you should, get whatever dose you can. So yeah. I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Carling. Marianne, Jamie, thoughts on vaccine rollouts?
Well, like I said earlier, I think there's certainly some frustration on somewhat over-promising and under-delivering since early February, which isn't intended to be a finger-pointing exercise, but I mentioned this on our last webinar. It's seeing our neighbors to the south, or as Jamie put it, looking into their backyard and seeing, roughly 60% of people in San Diego being fully vaccinated. And it was like one of the worst places in terms of outbreak. And I personally know about 5 or 6 people in their 30s who live in different parts of the United States and the UK who are all fully vaccinated. And in terms of rollout, I think the challenge is that we view ourselves as we're not only a G7 nation, but we view ourselves as quite influential on the global stage. And so to be behind countries in rollout like Chile and Morocco, I think people are starting to question. The reason for this, I think, is, and some of the countries that have done exceptionally well in managing the outbreak, like Taiwan and different parts of East Asia, is because we're not used to threats in Canada, like other parts of the world, particularly, as it pertains to China and East Asia. National security and these types of threats, they're very quick to act. Canada is predominantly a peaceful, safe, democratic environment, and we're not used to dealing with mass crises domestically, not to mention the dynamics, very complicated, highly convoluted dynamics with the provinces. I think it just demonstrates the challenges we face to act in emergency situation. And while we would have thought we would have learned from the Spanish flu and the outbreak of polio, it's just demonstrating that we really, once this is over, we really need to sit down and think about having a proper strategy at the federal level to respond more quickly in the future.
Yeah, totally agree, Marianne. I want to move on, but before we do, I know there's been some questions coming in about pandemic. Carling, throw it to you. Do we have one that we should answer?
Yeah, I'll just remind everybody again, put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm monitoring them and we'll get to as many of them as I can. I have one on anti-maskers, but before I get to that one, someone asked, speaking of BC, how is the virus so suddenly taken hold there? I mean, my view is it was kind of twofold. One, people became a little bit complacent because, all the news is about people getting vaccinated, and all the folks in long-term care, and we're now up to, I think, everybody over 70 being able to get their vaccine. So I think people feeling like, okay, people are getting vaccinated, the risk is not there, but also variants, obviously. And I think that's the case all over the country. I mean, my colleagues can speak to that better than I can, but so I think for those two reasons, that's why it's taken hold so quickly. We had over 1,000 new cases yesterday, which BC hasn't had ever. It's a new record for us. So yeah, I think that's why. But the question about anti-maskers. So, and feel free, whoever wants to jump in on this one. How do you explain the anti-masker movement in Canada how do you explain the anti-masker movement in Canada where people seem completely willing to ignore the facts about the virus and put themselves and others at risk? Is it politically driven? Anybody want to take that one?
It's an interesting question. Yeah.
I'll start. So I think, people tend to frame this as just a political movement. It's actually, I think there's a lot going on in the undercurrents here, right? And so there's been a long road towards ongoing erosion in trust in our public institutions for quite a while. And predominantly some of that has actually come from more sort of extremist right-wing conservative type politicians. So we're seeing, attacks on the media and people, calling them the lamestream media and I can't trust the media. There's been I think a bit of a failure from some of the big tech companies and how they moderate content and how they let some of these things permeate across the ecosphere. And I also just think, yeah, there is a bit of a public political motivation to this, and the fact that these movements are being in some ways embraced, if not hijacked, by more sort of right-leaning conservative figures, not necessarily mainstream conservative figures, but more right-wing conservative figures. And there is a soupçon of white supremacy also at play here, right? So there's a bit of, I feel like the world is spinning out of control and I'm being told all these things that I do are wrong, and this is the hill I'm gonna die on, right? And the government can't tell me nothing. And so I don't think it's necessarily it isn't driven necessarily by politics, but there's a whole bunch of like the crazy little Venn diagram there that gets us to that place.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, guys, I'm gonna have to move on. I know we could talk about the pandemic for the full hour, but I do want to get to some other topics. I want to turn our attention to the annual government budget cycles that are underway at both provincial and federal levels. Chris, I'm going to go to you for Ontario because they just tabled their provincial budget. What are your thoughts on that provincial government saying that they do not foresee a return to balanced budgets until the end of this decade?
I think if you ask the average Ontarian at this point in the pandemic, they'll go, meh, right? Like the Ford government road to power on this idea of, like, their whole narrative was, fiscal responsibility, the party with the taxpayers' money is over. And they're still trying to maintain some of that sort of narrative through line, even in the face of having to throw millions and billions of dollars at the pandemic response. So I don't think the electorate is particularly bothered at this moment around they're not keeping their promise. Though it does seem that the government is somewhat seized with it. What you saw was there is some messaging still in the budget that talks about getting back to balance at some point. So it's still an important sort of political flagpole, but the actual reality is I don't think it's going to matter too much. Ontarians and Canadians, we saw this in numbers in a poll that we did a while ago, are quite pragmatic at this point in their politics, right? And they're again kind of in this place where it's like, please throw money at the problem. Please make sure that I get my vaccine, that my mom gets a vaccine, that my kid gets a vaccine, and then we can have a bigger conversation when it's time for us to have a bigger conversation. And I think what you saw from this budget was, a very pragmatic for the time budget. It tried to address, strategic vulnerabilities for them in the long-term care sector, although they didn't necessarily address them in the way that I would necessarily like. I mean, let's pay our long-term care workers more beyond June 30th. Then anyway, whole other discussion. And so what you're seeing is if the political aim of this budget, just to keep this short, is to not cause any problems for the government, then mission accomplished, right? Like, they invested where they need to invest. They didn't get into any big, huge spending discussions. They don't want to get into those until the federal government actually starts to kind of open up on what they want to do from a long-term structural or, a short-term stimulus perspective. So, from a political standpoint, mission accomplished, even though there are some concerns around cuts to education and, not paying our frontline heroes what they're due.
Okay, Marianne, what about the federal government? What expectations around the federal budget can we expect, which will be tabled on April 19th?
Yes, so firstly, it's a historic budget, I would argue, because we haven't, I don't know in history if we've gone this long since Canada is a country beyond the Second World War, of the number of months we've lived without a budget. So us political dorks are counting down the days to April 19th. Look, it's going to be, I think, a platform document in many respects, as we'll likely get to talking about the rumor mill around a potential federal election and when it might be. But I think it's fair to say that the federal government unexpectedly saw strong economic growth in the last quarter, and I don't think it was anticipated in the same breadth as they probably would have thought. But despite, a stark downturn, I think we can anticipate that we'll see continued stimulus, short-term support for the hospitality, service, and tourism sectors, extension of the emergency subsidy program for workers and businesses. I think Minister Freeland dangled a hint at her in the fall economic statement around childcare. Obviously, that is an issue and theme that's been front and center in this pandemic. I think it would be fair to say that we will see something in the budget on that front. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a very squarely focused on economic recovery and supporting industries in the short term and long term.
Okay, very interesting. Carling, British Columbia is expected to release their budget the day after the federal government is. What can we expect to see from that?
I will answer that one sec, but one of our attendees had a great comment that I just wanted to highlight based on the federal budget, which is from Kate. This is also a historic budget, as it will be the first time in Canadian history that one has been delivered by a woman. So thought that was a good, cool to include. So BC, yeah, BC has a budget the day after the federal budget. So lots of fun for me and my colleagues out in BC. It'll be a busy week for us. The Premier delivered a speech from the throne back in December post provincial election. It was really short. Like, I think it was 7 pages long or something like that. And he highlighted the things that his government will focus on in the next 4 years. So fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, providing better healthcare for people and families, delivering affordability and security in our communities, and investing in good jobs and livelihoods for a clean energy future. So he's already laid out sort of what his government is going to focus on in the next 4 years. And I expect that will be reflected in the upcoming budget. We are going to have another speech from the throne here in BC the week before the budget, so April 12th. So we're expecting the Premier to prorogue Parliament just in order to do that sometime in the next couple of weeks. They're on break right now. But, you know, there may be a little bit more detail in the speech from the throne, or I expect there will be, but I don't expect them to deviate from those sort of 4 priorities. The other thing I'll add, much like the federal budget, childcare is a huge conversation out here. Lots of people struggling to find childcare and struggling to pay for it. So I expect we'll see more stuff on that in the budget.
Okay, very interesting. Looking forward to that. Jamie, the question is to balance or not to balance. Just how accepting do you think Canadians will be on seeing their governments running huge deficits?
Well, I'm going to draw from what Chris said. Right now, I think if you were to press most Canadians as to whether or not they're concerned about the deficit during this time, the answer would be overwhelmingly no, I would think, for the average Canadian. I think they just want to be, made whole, first of all, made safe, then made whole, and we'll worry about the bill later. How that bill arrives, though, how it's presented to Canadians after this will be where controversy will inevitably erupt. I mean, the numbers federally are pretty eye-popping in terms of just real numbers. I think we're talking about $365 billion. That number could even grow higher than that. Here in Saskatchewan, you have a provincial budget that's going to be announced on the 6th. Revenues are down 10%, but budget deficit is $3 billion. That's a big number in Saskatchewan. And but I right at this moment, I don't think Canadians are focused on that as much as they are those important core things that matter to them, and it will matter to them either in the form of higher taxes at some point, reduction in services, how the government decides to plan to reduce it will come later, and that's when the greater scrutiny will come. But I think on balance, I think most Canadians, they're aware of it and they see it, but they're not. I don't think they're all. I don't think they're as fussed about it right now. Economists are fussed about it. Business is very concerned about it, because ultimately, as I said, that bill will be presented at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jamie. It's that not yet scenario, right? But it
right,
comes, but not yet. Carling, I want to move on, but let's take a question from a viewer around this topic if we have one.
Sure. So we have a couple questions from the audience about timing of an election. I think we're going to come to that in a minute, so
Yeah.
I'll leave those. Of course, we all have an opinion about that. But let's take this one. Chris, how has Doug Ford managed to maintain his relative level of support and popularity in Ontario, unlike other Conservative premiers like Jason Kenney in Alberta and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan? And Jamie, you might have something to add too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the Ontario part and Jamie can take the other. So I think, last numbers I saw, the Ford government is at 38% popularity, and 68% of Ontarians or something like that say that Doug Ford has done a good job of managing the pandemic. So I think there's a perception, and kind of I always track this kind of really interesting thing Premier Ford does, where he doesn't center himself in the pandemic as the guy who can fix the problem, but he centers himself in the pandemic as the pandemic is happening to all of us, and I'm just doing the best I can, right? Which from an expectation management and political management perspective is actually quite canny in regards to, like, if something happens, all you need to do really is just pivot to, like, we're working as hard as possible. Like, even today in the lead up to the announcement at 1:30, you're hearing we were meeting until midnight and we were on top of this. So the pandemic is kind of framed as an externality to the government, not that it's at the center of what they're doing, which makes it easier for them to say, frontline heroes, we love you, we love all this other stuff, but not actually get ahead of it, because there's risk of getting ahead of it and actually just saying, I'm going to actually manage it. Now, there is actually life cost to that in regards to being able to actually effectively get ahead of it and manage it. But from just a straight up political management piece, I think that's where some of this happens. Also, if you look at where the pandemic is hitting the hardest, it is in areas that aren't strategically and politically as valuable for the premier. Not to say that decisions are being made based on that, but what I'm saying is, on aggregate in the province, if I live in sort of rural Ontario, Eastern Ontario, other places that haven't been hit necessarily as hard as, say Toronto, downtown Toronto has been, that doesn't necessarily affect the how do I think I'm handling the pandemic number. The challenge is, though, in the 905, when you look at Brampton and Peel and Mississauga, Brampton has a 16.2% positivity rate. And if that doesn't get under control soon, I think you're going to start to see the 905 start to erode a little bit more, which could put them in a bit of a danger spot. But the way that they've dealt with sort of the rhetoric around the pandemic seems to be working for them for now.
That's an interesting strategy, Chris. Thanks. Jamie, do you want to get in on the second part about popularity of the Conservative premiers, Jason Kenney, Scott Moe?
I would agree that the Scott Moe's popularity remains high. I would challenge the premise that Jason Kenney's popularity is still high in Alberta. And who would have thought, right? When Rachel Notley was first elected, when it was 2015, I believe, there was within 6 months, she was in deep political peril, and there was a lot of second guessing. How could we have done this? How could we have elected a new Democrat in Alberta? The numbers from last month, a couple of public opinion polls, one from Leger, I think the other one was Angus Reid, although I'm not quite sure about that, had the NDP actually in the lead in Alberta. So, that's a topic that, there's reasons for that decline. And it really stems to just the economic reality for Alberta that it has gone through such a fundamental shift from its core economic base, and that shift is occurring right underneath their feet, that any government that is in that position, added on top of a crisis like the one we have now with COVID, the term that I've heard lately is multi-crisis leadership, and whether or not leaders can balance, huge disruptive issues and files in front of them. There's not many people like who in the 1940s in Britain who had the capacity to do that, is that kind of thing. So it's tested all politicians. It's not just certain premiers. Everybody has had their test. Everybody could easily say, this isn't what I signed up for politically. But the point is that that you're going to lose support no matter what when this kind of, I hate to use the term bombardment, is coming in from the perimeter and coming so fast that it's difficult to manage the communications, it's difficult to manage the policy, and it's really difficult to manage the public opinion.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Good points. Panelists, let's move on to some of the hot political topics that have come up this past month. I know we have viewer questions on this. Carling just mentioned. The first up is speculation around the federal election. Marianne, do you think it has died down, or do you think we might still be going to the polls this spring?
As we say in Ottawa, people who say they know usually don't know, and those who keep quiet know everything. So look, it's really interesting right now because there's a few polls that have come out over the last week that show the Liberals between 8 and 9% ahead of the Conservatives right now, which is very positive for the current government. Now, that said, all things considered, you might gather that, oh, this would be a perfect time to spring an election. But when we have effectively in 3 Liberal strongholds, BC, Quebec, and Ontario are going into some type of short-term, long-term lockdown, I think it's safe to say that the rumor mill is shifting to a less likely to be a spring, more likely summer, fall election. Interestingly, we've had 4 provincial elections throughout the pandemic. Yeah. Saskatchewan, BC, have and Newfoundland most recently, in addition to New Brunswick, have all re-elected incumbent governments, which is interesting to think because Trudeau would likely be hoping to potentially get that minority back to a majority if dealing with the pandemic well. But while 3 of the 4 provinces managed to hold elections quite smoothly throughout the pandemic, Newfoundland is a great case example of the logistical nightmare that can take place when COVID cases spike unexpectedly. So what looked like a Liberal stronghold or landslide rather in Newfoundland quickly deteriorated when voters were struggling to get their mail-in ballots in. Logistics were changing consistently. And while they still won, they certainly did not win at the same rate that the polls were indicating and then at the margins that they had hoped. So all this to say, I think the federal government presently would be smart to wait until there's a bit more certainty around vaccine rollout, because if they were to call an election a week ago, 2 weeks ago, it would probably look quite favorable. But right now, I'm looking towards next week or 2 weeks from now to see if that margin between the Liberals and Conservatives comes a bit closer.
Okay.
Kaveri, can I jump in?
Absolutely.
I agree with Marianne. People are cranky, and yeah, 8 or 9%. I get it. It's very alluring. It looks like, if we call it now, we're going to win. But your points are really well made, because if you if you, what we don't know can happen seems to happen within days, hours, and that shifts people. And if any of the stuff we were talking about earlier, once things calm down and people start to pay attention and the postmortems are made about how this government has handled the pandemic in general, and the scrutiny comes in, you know, all of a sudden people might go, well, wait a minute, we thought they did a good job. Didn't they do a good job? They told us they were doing a good job. And now I'm hearing maybe they didn't do a good job. And so, and that affect, you know, one-on-one, right? That affected me. That affected my job. That particular policy hurt me. I'm not sure people are paying close enough attention. Yeah, I think the raw politics are clear, but they're not all that clear. There's some opaque parts that I would be concerned of by calling an election.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. You know, so as we talk about, of course, you know, potential election, Chris, I want your perspective on this. What will it take to defeat Justin Trudeau then in this next federal election?
I think it depends on who you ask. Some people might say garlic and a long wooden stake. I don't know. I feel like, yeah, this government is interesting because they're, and just sorry for the other really bad analogy, but they're a bit like a vending machine. If you really want to tip one over, you have to just keep pushing and pushing, and then finally the momentum will tip it over, right? And so, you know, we've seen this government who has gone through either scandals, real or perceived. We had a massive, what would have usually been a massive electoral bomb with, you know, some really awful yearbook photos, and, you know, he survived, right? And so I think if anybody is going to be able to tip Justin Trudeau over when it comes to the next election, I think people need to be really clear about what elections generally are, right? And so I know a lot's been written about the West Wing, and that it's, you know, really, and I agree that it's actually made way more people think about politics and government as, you know, just a bunch of smart people walking around talking, and not actually the exercise of power and who wins and who loses. But there's been a couple of truisms that come from that show. And one is that elections are essentially not finding the answer to a question, but actually a battle for the question itself. And for the last two elections, we've had kind of the question trying to be, well, do you really trust Justin Trudeau? Is he the right guy? And it's all this like very Justin focused messaging, which we now know doesn't work. Because what ends up happening is in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, the Liberals go, you thought the campaign was about this, it's actually about this, and leaving most parties flat-footed to be able to respond, and thus here we are. So for context, I think people need to have a better definition of what the election question is and start really, and that question changes. So if it happens in July, way different question, because the government's going to want the question to be about, look, we have certainty in the system right now. People are getting their vaccines. Don't change horses midstream. Whereas if you go in September, the question is going to probably be a lot more future looking. And does that actually expose a vulnerability for the Liberal Party and the government at play around spending, and what does their vision of the future look like versus the Conservative version of the future versus the NDP vision of the future, right? And so let's get the question right. And second is target, right? And if they're running if we're running a big message campaign that is all about how, you know, Justin Trudeau's bad, you will lose the election. This election is going to come down to some very targeted fights in some key vote-rich areas. The Liberals need to win something like 20 more seats or 16 more seats in order to form a majority. The Conservatives need to win 50 to win a majority. And a lot of that are going to be battlegrounds in the 905, right? And so we are going to need to figure out, and any opposition party that needs to take away some of those seats in the 905 and build that strength is really going to have to focus in on a message that's not a big, broad national message. I mean, you're going to need to have one just to be able to have in the cans of the campaign, but what is motivating those voters? And it may not just be one panacea, right? And so just back to my original point there is that most opposition parties to date haven't been that highly targeted in their messaging. They've gone really big, broad. We don't like the government. We don't like Justin Trudeau. And I think we need to get a better sense of what the question is and who the targets are, and just focus on those, like pound those as hard as possible over the next little while. And I think that's partially where you're seeing some of the changes with Aaron O'Toole and sort of where they're trying to pivot away from some of these other issues that have been a bit of a anchor around them, is because when those fights are happening in the 905, predominantly it's the fight for the hearts and minds of women voters. And what they're seeing right now from Aaron O'Toole and the opposition isn't necessarily something that's motivating to vote for them.
Okay.
That's a lot, I know.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Okay, you brought up the opposition parties, Aaron O'Toole. I want to shift to the federal Conservatives right now. And of course, the big news this past month was on the Conservative Policy Convention. Carling, what did you think about the big news that delegates rejected to acknowledge that climate change is real for their policy book?
Well, so the media seized on just that, you know, the Conservatives deny that climate change is real. But the reality is that was in the preamble to the motion or the resolution. That wasn't the resolution itself. What people were, you know, what the motion was about highly polluting industries taking responsibility to implement measures to curb emissions. And we know, like, you know, it's not a surprise. That's a very lively discussion within the Conservative Party. But the climate change is real, or is real part was in the preamble to the resolution. The leader of the party, Aaron O'Toole, has said he believes climate change is real. He's promised to produce a climate plan before the next election. And I think he recognizes that the Conservatives need to have a credible plan to reach people, voters, like, for example, the women in the 905 that Chris talked about. So I think he gets it. You know, I hope some in the party who maybe don't agree might be won over, but we'll see.
Okay, interesting points. Jamie, I want to take us to politics on the prairies. You and I are on the prairies together here in Saskatchewan. We're both seeing and feeling that Wexit movement, and we're hearing some talk of that Western separatist sentiment. How vulnerable do you think Premier Scott Moe and Jason Kenney is in this regard?
Well, first of all, I want to just say that if I ever need to tip over a vending machine, I'm going to call Chris Ball. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which you had you had way too much clarity, and it sounded like experience, Chris, in that actual activity. Look, you know, Western discontent. I've lived here my whole life. It is at an all-time high. There's no question. In the last provincial election in Saskatchewan, the Buffalo Party actually ran second in 4 constituencies. Got almost 3% of the vote. That sounds like nothing, but that's how that's how political movements here start. The effect of that is that you have the provincial government here in Saskatchewan paying as much attention, if not more, to that 3% issue in the South, usually in rural Saskatchewan, as they are to the official opposition in the NDP. That's astonishing. So it's real. Whether it goes and runs its course, I think most Canadian or most Western Canadians, in particular in Saskatchewan, you know, believe in Canada. But it is coming with a lot of caveats associated with it. So in Jason Kenney's case, he is talking about a referendum on equalization. They're talking about a provincial police force, other matters that speak to nationhood, to distance themselves from the federal government. Now, again, that is bumping into what's going on in Alberta with an NDP party that is resurgent. So it's not going away, but I can tell you from personal experience, and Kaveri, you've been here a long time as well, it's acutely real. And it is, it wouldn't take much, or it wouldn't take very much at all if a credible voice was to emerge in Western Canada on the prairies to throw the proverbial match on this and turn it into something even more problematic and more harmful to the country. That's a downer. I'm sorry to say it that way, but there is incredible frustration here. And I will cite one example on carbon tax, even though it has been decided at the Supreme Court that it is in fact a legitimate tax imposed by the federal government. When you have, the provincial government here is now going to determine what that actually looks like and how it is a provincial tax is actually imposed. That will be the next critical fight, because it affords the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario, if Ontario in fact joins again, to create something that would likely be summarily rejected by the federal government, and away we go again. We're into a different discussion on a different policy of, we tried to come up with something that addressed grain farming for farmers who farm propane to dry grain. The idea that there is a disproportionate amount of taxation being borne by the agricultural community, if that is not addressed by the federal government in advance of the province putting something in the window, we'll be in this discussion again for another period of time. And it all hurts national unity, frankly.
Thanks, Jamie. Guys, I'm looking at the clock. We're going to have to wrap here really soon. So I just want to take a viewer question, a really quick one. And panelists, try to keep your answers short for this one, just for sake of time. Carling?
This one's super short. Marianne, is there any discussion federally of charitable sector resiliency, sustainability funding?
A really good question, and I work quite actively in the space. I wish I had better news, but no, I would say that the sector has been sadly left to sort of the wayside. I think part of the issue is the charitable and not-for-profit sector doesn't fit nicely and neatly into one particular department. It depends on what industry they're operating in, whether it's the arts, health, that sort of thing. That said, I don't know who posed the question or what sort of frame they're coming from. There was a chunk of money that was put forward in the federal, or the fiscal economic statement in November by Minister Freeland. There was several $1 billion for a variety of programs that do help the social and innovation sector, for example, housing. So I'd encourage you, depending on what industry the not-for-profit or charitable organization is based, get in touch with the department and see if there is programming available, funding available. It's more in that regard, in a patchwork sort of way. But fingers crossed we see something in a couple of weeks in the federal budget. I'm really hoping that there's something for these groups, because I know they're in dire need.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. Gang, we're going to have to wrap up here. Do want to ask you guys really quickly, as government relations strategists, strategic communication strategists, what are you guys looking for in the days and weeks ahead? I give you 30 seconds. I'm going to throw to Carling.
I guess the main thing that I'm watching right now like everybody, is the spikes in cases, the increasing prevalence of variants. I know that vaccines are rolling out, but it seems like the variants are taking hold before those vaccines can get in arms, and so it's concerning. So definitely paying a lot of attention to that.
Chris?
Yes, still on the vaccine front. Is there going to be a pivot for public health authorities on who their targets are for vaccines, especially here in Ontario and Toronto, right, where we're seeing the prevalence of cases being frontline workers in BIPOC communities, etc. Are we going to maybe tweak the criteria so it's not age-based, it's actually, frontline and where the actual outbreaks are happening?
Okay, Jamie, over to you.
I think you're going to see the federal government try to pull its communications efforts into a more coherent place, so that there's not these sort of eruptions from different organizations within the federal government. I'm saying that that's going to be a political imperative to try and get the messaging straight, because as we've talked about, people are confused. The AstraZeneca thing felt like somebody was driving down the highway and decided to test the parking brake while they were going, and all of a sudden people were like, wait, what? Is that me? Have I had it? So I think there's going to be some movement on the comms front to try and redress some of that confusion. Good luck to them, by the way.
Okay, Marianne, you have the last word.
Obviously, vaccine rollout, it's going to be front and center for everyone. They're going to have to act quickly and swiftly. And of course, any update on federal election date.
Okay, perfect. Panelists, I want to thank you so much for joining me today for the Earnscliffe Political Strategy panel. A big thank you to our viewers who stayed with us during this hour. And if any of our viewers are interested in getting more insights on any of the topics we covered today, don't hesitate to reach out to me personally, or please go to our website at earnscliffe.ca and click on the tab that says Contact Us. We will be doing this political strategy panel on the first Thursday of every month, so I look forward to seeing everyone again next month. But until then,